Hello and welcome to another Tuesday Talk with Ruby Reese. My name is Killian and I am co-founder at Ruby Reese, and I'll also be your host. This week we're talking about the super important topic of breed-specific legislation in Ireland, and more generally, if it works, and what implications the XL bully ban will have in Ireland. If you think this topic might be interesting to some of your friends, please do share out this episode with them. It would be great if more people could value from the brilliant information that Anne is just about to share with us in the conversation you are just about to listen into. So without further ado, I invite you now to listen into our chat. Anne, thank you so much for joining us in the podcast this week. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Would you do us the pleasure of introducing yourself briefly?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Anne Rogers and I am from a company called ANIED, or Animal Education. I have to explain that to everybody. And we are a private education company. We specialise in delivering education and educational resources to professionals, to organisations, and straight to guardians as well. So that's what we do on a day-to-day basis. So it's great to get to do more of that on your podcast as well.
Thank you so much for coming on and helping to educate us a little bit. You picked a brilliant topic and a super important one for this evening that I'm sure that everyone will be really interested to learn more about. So we picked breed-specific legislation. When we speak about breed-specific legislation in Ireland, do we mean both restricted breed lists as well as our first ever breed ban, the XL bully ban?
That's exactly it. So breed-specific legislation refers to any legislation really that targets by naming specific presumed or so-called breeds of dog. So we have a couple of layers of that now. So we have a restricted breeds list that's been part of dog control legislation here since the 1990s, and that listed out certain dogs, types of dogs, and mandated that those dogs must be muzzled and on lead and held by a person, suitably strong enough to control the dog in public and over the age of 16. And it included breeds that were listed as the American Pit Bull Terrier, German Shepherd, Staffordshire Bull Terrier is on there, Doberman Pinscher, Rottweiler, etc., etc., etc. And then this year, with plans to expand breed-specific legislation here, and the original plans were to expand the restricted breeds list. But now what's actually happened is it's going in the same direction as the UK has done just before, so just last year. We've added breed banning legislation, which we've never had here before, to this dog control kind of mandate. And they have now released guidance just a few days ago on banning the so-called XL bully, which is a type of American bully, the largest one. XL stands for extra large, so it's the big one, and they have devised a breed standard, which is a list of physical characteristics that will supposedly allow them to identify and distinguish XL bullies from other types of dogs. And what they've done is they've taken the XL bully standard that was written by DEFRA for their legislation, and they've just brought it over here. So that's what has happened, and the XL bully ban comes into effect from the 1st of October. So next week really is what we're talking about at this stage. And that's what's coming our way in relation to that.
And regarding the XL bully and the other restricted breeds on that list that was previously in place, do these breeds share any common traits, or why are they on lists in the first place?
So I suppose the restricted breeds list originally was, a bit of an amalgamation of targeting breeds that were of large stature and that were maybe associated with, danger in various jurisdictions around the world. So the restricted breeds list was a funny one because it originally included some other dogs as well, which were eventually removed. So, for example, the English Bulldog was included on that list very, very early on. this legislation generally reflects trends. So there would be trends in the media, in terms of representing dogs who looked a certain way. So, for example, we have like the Japanese Tosa on our restricted breeds list, and that's because it was named in typing legislation in the UK around, previous to our restricted breeds list. Even though there were next to no Japanese Tosas in Ireland or the UK at the time, but we've restricted them anyway, and we have them on these lists and things like that. So it generally tends to reflect trends. Particularly relating to kind of media sensation and that kind of thing. They don't always make sense. If we look at BSL in various jurisdictions from around the world, sometimes there are dogs on there that you're going, really? Where has that come from? And so it will reflect local trends. So at the time of writing, they included, for example, the Japanese Akita, is what's listed in our restricted breeds list, and the Japanese Akita isn't a thing anymore. The breeds have kind of split and diverged, and we have Akita Inus and we have American Akitas, but the legislation lists, as well as those specific breeds, it lists any strain or mix of these listed breeds. So it allows the legislation to open up to interpretation, essentially. So it kind of broadens it in that respect. But generally speaking, the kind of the shared traits or the shared criteria, I suppose, for including dogs like this, it's usually relating to kind of trends in sensation and trends in media reporting, for sure.
And that probably answers a lot of the questions that I had, because like looking at the list, I mean, I've never seen that many Rhodesian Ridgebacks in Ireland.
Yeah, not a lot.
And any one that I have met has been the most lovable dog ever. Now I'm sure there's exceptions,
sure.
but
so this is the misconception. The misconception then is that dogs that are listed here must be listed because they represent some danger. And one of the arguments that people will make is, oh, well, they're such big dogs, but that makes no sense, because if we look at the 200 and something breeds of dog that are, that we call breeds of dog that are recognised in kennel clubs, I mean, there are lots of dogs bigger. There are lots of dogs with larger heads, so that reflects larger jaws. There are lots of dogs that have been, selected for more intense sort of interactions with people. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But at that time, it reflected what the sensation or the media sensation looked like at that time. So it's a bit of a snapshot in time, in terms of going back to the 80s and really kind of tabloid sensation type sharing of stories about dogs.
And talking about certain breeds, do you believe certain breeds are inherently more dangerous than others, or is it more about the upbringing and training?
So the thing here is that breed is absolutely something that's relevant when we start to talk about behaviour. And that's because when we actually look at what breeds are, we might analyse breeds as being kind of we might define them slightly differently. So we might look at breeds as being reflection of kind of genomic groups. So, or we might look at breeds that reflect kennel club groups, for example, which are kind of human constructs, so just on paper. And the problem is that because the focus is on breed, that means that we miss a whole lot of the nuance that's essentially associated with behaviour. So while breed is not irrelevant, it is by far one of the least relevant pieces of information that we have found to be indicative of increased risk of causing serious damage to humans. So the problem with concentrating on breed, whether you concentrate on it in saying, well, these breeds, this dog that looks this way, because when we identify breeds, we're identifying dogs via morphological characteristics. So we're deciding that this dog, because he looks this way, he is black and tan and he has prick ears, right? And every dog then, that we think that's a German Shepherd, let's say, right? Even though it might not be. And we know that the way that dogs inherit morphological characteristics makes visual identification really difficult to do, right? right? So that is well established, and we have valid data to support that. We also know that using DNA testing to identify breeds is terribly flawed as well. And we have no published data on that because the companies who keep these databases don't publish data. And so they can only identify genomic characteristics, or genetic characteristics, that reflect whatever database they have, right? So this is why you will get different breed IDs from different companies, for example, for the same dog. So identifying breeds is the first problem that we have, right? And this is because of the way that dogs inherit morphological characteristics, so size, coat, ear carriage, those sorts of things that we use to so-called identify them. And then the other problem that we have is that breed is a poor predictor of behaviour. And that's because it's only in the last couple of 100 years where we've really started to select for breeds, this specific kind of kennel club type idea of what a breed is. And that's been based on morphological characteristics.
And then on top of that, we have the crossbreeds, our mixed breeds on top of that then as well.
So that muddies the water as well. So as soon as we go into mixes of mixed breeds, so F1 generations where you have one breed plus one breed making babies, but then when you go into mixed breed and mixed breed making babies, it becomes really difficult to identify anybody. And I mean, work going back to, Scott and Fuller's work in the 1960s demonstrated that, that it just wasn't easy to identify dogs' lineage or parentage based on their morphological characteristics, so how they look, what they look like. And it's very difficult to tie that with behavioural tendencies. Now, the difficulty comes, though, when we start to talk about quite breed-specific characteristics. So, for example, one of the equations that I'll often use for people is I will say to them, well, we probably wouldn't imagine a basset hound doing that hard-eye staring and stalking of sheep that you might see a border collie do, right? So, I would be hard-pressed to find a basset hound that does that. And if anybody has one on footage of it, I would love to see it because I would need that for sure. As I wouldn't expect a border collie necessarily to be as good at some of the things we've selected scent hounds to do, for example. So there are absolutely breed typical behavioural tendencies that are usually related to inherited predatory sequence behaviours, so predatory motor action patterns, so like chasing and stalking and tracking and biting and things like that, for sure. So breed offers you a kind of a very broad guess at the sorts of tendencies a dog might show. But it doesn't provide us with enough information, because in modern breeding practices, it's, for general pet dogs that are, around in the world, for most of the companion dogs that we will see, we're not doing heavy selection for or against behavioural characteristics. And even if we were, then maybe only about 63 to about 75% of the population, even with really heavy selection for behavioural characteristics, we usually see only up to about 3/4 of the population showing some version of those characteristics. So even then. So you had kind of asked, sorry, I'm still talking, but you had asked about whether it's about, how the dog is raised. And here's the thing. Puppies are not clean slates, so they absolutely do come with genetic tendencies, but also it's not all in how they're raised either. So it's neither of those things. It would be lovely if we could put them into lovely little neat boxes and say, yes, this is all genetic and that's the problem, or it's all, this thing, but we can't do that. And that's because behaviour, the dog's behavioural tendencies, so the development of their neurological system, for example, is being affected since conception. So from the time of conception, so before puppy is born, the experiences that mama has had, and even from an epigenetic point of view, the experiences that dad has had, may have impacts on how this puppy's neurological and other biological relevant systems develop. So since conception, so long before you knew your puppy existed, right, inside mum, there are environmental things there that are impacting them. And we had recent work from, I think, maybe 21 or 22 that found that the most effects that heritability will have on behaviour is about 9%. Which is, and that varies terribly across dogs and across individuals. So the problem is that breed, or what we presume is the dog's breeds cannot give us sufficient information about the behaviour of individuals. It just can't provide us with that.
Absolutely. And then I guess once a puppy is born, then you've got things like their environment, their training, and potentially socialization early on in particular.
Yeah.
Do these things also have a large impact on their behavior?
Huge impact. So behavior lives in the environment, which means that behavior is always an interaction between the individual and what's going on outside their body. So, and that counts for even if, for example, we were just talking about this before we started, that even if a dog is painful, for example, let's say a dog is painful and they start to snap or snarl when their human nudges off them on the sofa. And we would say, oh, that behavior change is caused by pain. And that's, I guess, a little bit of a shortening of what's actually going on. So yes, pain is an internal experience, and your experience of pain is going to be individual to you. It's different to mine. It's different to that dog. It's different to that dog, right? So everybody's pain experience is absolutely internal and different. But the way that pain interacts with the environment is that this dog, they're snarling or snapping when a person bumps off them or gets too close to them, becomes more relevant or salient behavior. Because if I'm painful, it becomes more valuable to me to get people to move away from me. So I will use distance increasing behavior, because getting space from people so they don't bump off me so I'm not sore. If I've sore hips or sore back, or, all of the old age things, that can happen, and happen people too. So that snarling or snapping behavior still lives in the environment. It still happens because of something that's happening around the dog. So behavior lives in the environment all the time. So if we want to talk about safety or danger in respect to dogs, we're usually talking about behaviours that we refer to as aggressive behaviours, right? So biting behaviour, snapping, snarling behaviours, growling, maybe even jumping up behaviours, mouthing behaviours that puppies or adolescent dogs might do. And all of those behaviours are present in all dogs, regardless of what they look like. It doesn't matter what they look like. And again, we have some experiments that have shown, unfortunately, because they would have had to put dogs under extreme pressure, but they've shown that all dogs will show aggressive behaviour, the behaviours that we call aggressive, at some level of stimulation. So normal, natural, necessary dog behaviour is what presents risks to humans.
And talking about stimulation, just for people at home that might not have a per se aggressive dog, or a dog that's feeling pain or has had any sort of situation that might make them be stimulated towards aggressive behaviours. Even, I'm guessing, in play, because if you rile a dog up to in playful behaviour, they can start the barking and the growling and the so even if you look at it in that sense, I guess you can see in, for example, our friend in our friend's Cavachon, you'll see a lot of these behaviours coming out as well, can't you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Again, all dogs will show some sort of this behaviour. So people will say to me, for example, oh, does that dog bite? And I will always say yes, because that dog has evolved a mouth. And if animals evolved mouths, like ourselves, we also have mouths, mouths evolved originally to bite things, right? So dogs have evolved mouths. They all have one. Every dog you meet will have a mouth, and they all bite. And biting is a normal part of dogs' communicative systems. So they use their mouths in similar ways that we use our hands, for example, and because they don't have opposable thumbs and all of that sort of stuff, the primate tools, so they use their mouths in all sorts of situations. So I think one of the things that I want to emphasize with people is that there is no aggressive dog or aggressive breed. We've never been able to identify genes that make dogs more predisposed to aggression with any great certainty, and we haven't been able to identify those consistently in dogs who show biting behavior, for example, though there are efforts to do it, and that's because aggression is an umbrella term. It's a human construct that we've decided, there's behaviors we don't like. But actually, we should start to talk about the conditions under which behaviour happens. So, and this would be the same for people, right? There's no dog that's aggressive all the time. There's no person that's aggressive all the time. We would say that under certain conditions, dogs will carry out certain behaviours in order to acquire, access to something. So if we think of our painful dog, when somebody sits too close or bumps off that dog when they sit on the sofa, and that dog growls and the person withdraws, that behavior functions for that animal under those conditions. And aggressive behavior typically functions to increase distance or to gain social relief, essentially, for dogs, just as it does for people. We want that other dog or that other person or whatever to move away from us. And the thing is, dogs have a huge repertoire of distance increasing behavior, a huge repertoire, a much more advanced and broader repertoire of behaviors that ask very quite politely and subtly for distance versus pro-social behaviors, so behaviors that they say, you know, that are affiliative and say, I want to interact with you. And this is always telling, because it tells us here's an animal that has loads and loads. This guy will just join us for a bit, I'd say. That has famous at this stage, internet famous at this stage. The dogs will use a huge range of behaviors to ask politely for distance and for space and social relief. And really the problem for people is that we tend to only recognize growling and from growling up, and dogs will generally use growling when all of the other signals that they've been trying to get through to the stupid humans don't work. Because why would I do all the subtle things if growling is the thing that gets them to move away, or snapping is the thing that gets them to move away? So when we work with bite cases, which I do very regularly, we're usually seeing that most bites happen, or pretty much all bites happen really, as a result of a long kind of accumulation of social stressors building and building and building over time. And when we go through it, we typically find that the dog has probably been signaling and asking for relief or distance in these contexts for years.
So when we're saying signaling here, we're saying there's warning signs along the way.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. So dogs really have limited tools, because obviously they can't verbalize how they're feeling and what they want you to do, but that doesn't mean that they're not communicating with us. So they're using their body, their facial expressions, their body position, the kind of cumulative effects of their body movements, to communicate with other dogs, and also to communicate with other individuals, other species with whom they've been socialized. So humans or cats, maybe the dog lives in a house with cats, or lives in a house with horses, or or guinea pigs, or whoever, the full range. And dogs only have those tools to communicate. So because we're the primates with the big brains, it's our responsibility to learn a little bit about that. And there are certainly sets of signals where we have good information from some really interesting studies. The kind of the modern approach to looking at warning signaling in dogs, it's such an example of modern kind of science, where they've reviewed YouTube videos. So what a cool way of being a fly on the wall in some research, and seeing what behaviors are precursor to bites or snaps or those sorts of things. And we found that there were some consistencies there, and people having some understanding or idea of, he's just making a nest here.
That's fine.
That's why I sit on the spare bed to do this. So he'll make his nest, so it just looks a bit crazy, and I can't help him in any way. He's the designer of this, and he apparently knows what he's doing. He thinks he does, so that's what he's doing. So just in case it looks like he's humping or something, he's not.
For those listening in that mightn't have the video, Anne's dog is nesting in the background. So that's
oh god, provide context for sure.
So, yeah, exactly. So we'll leave him nest away.
Yes.
Okay, so they've been analysing these videos and seeing that there's actually groups of behaviours that could identify that a bite is on the way.
Absolutely. And usually in about the kind of 20-30 seconds before a bite, the dog is saying, now lads, come on, right, get out of my face now. And if that's not listened to, that'll escalate. So it'd be like yourself, if you're on a call or something like this, and somebody was to come in the door and you were to subtly say to them, oh, just give me a minute, but they persisted, you might say, oh no, you have to wait a minute. And then they came over to you and started to really kind of get in your face, and you might turn around, you might kind of snap at them and say, fuck off, or whatever it might be. And then if they put hands on you, you might turn around and actually push them away. So there's this escalation to our behavior, and the vast majority of what we refer to as aggressive behavior in dogs is ritualized. So I want you to think of what dogs' mouths and bodies are designed for, and their mouths and bodies are designed for killing other animals, right? So they have huge weaponry in their mouths, and yet despite that, and the way that we live with them and how much contact we have with them, them, they very rarely cause serious injury to humans. And that is not down to human behavior, let me tell you. That is almost always because dogs are going out of their way to inhibit their behavior towards people. So, obviously there are caveats to that when we start to talk about children versus dogs and that kind of thing, just because children are more vulnerable. But even then, that we very rarely see children killed by dogs. And I am not downplaying, but when I say these things, it's very important that I say I'm not downplaying the experience of the individual. Being bitten or witnessing a bite or growl or snap or snarl or anything like that is traumatizing for people. And I'm not downplaying the seriousness of that or the impacts to the individual. But from a public safety point of view, and a statistical point of view, which is a good deal colder, I'm afraid, that dogs typically inhibit their behavior towards humans, typically.
And I think that's an important point to make, to have a conversation where we can actually look at this kind of from an eagle eye perspective. We have to kind of stay away from the deep examples, because even though that would make for really, really good content, I think other media sources have been really good at running with those stories, whereas like we want to take a kind of a more holistic approach to the topic and stay quite fact-based. So therefore, you kind of have to stay a little bit cold. But yes, of course, for individuals, and there'll be situations and that maybe don't follow everything that we're saying as well. But then when we're talking back to the breed-specific laws, do you think they're effective in reducing dog bites or attacks overall?
Well, we have good data that tell us that since BSL has been enacted here in the mid-90s, we have 2 sets of studies that have looked at hospitalizations relating to dog bite injuries. And both have shown that since 2 sets of kind of 10-year kind of blocks of research by two different but related sets of data. And we found that dog bite related hospitalizations have increased. And this is a phenomena that is typically seen in jurisdictions where BSL has been enacted. So we have pretty good data that BSL is flawed via its rationale, and pretty good data that tells us that it doesn't reduce bites or improve human safety. So, we don't even need to go any further, right? That's the information, right? And so that tells us then that there are other motivations, political motivations essentially, for enacting this sort of legislation.
So would it be fair then to kind of jump to the conclusion that maybe breed-specific legislation might unfairly target responsible dog owners as well as well-behaved pets?
Absolutely. So again, the dogs are the vulnerable parties in this, right? They have no choice about whether they're born, where they're born, what parentage is put together, what conditions they're exposed to from the time of conception. So they're the vulnerable parties in this. So BSL discriminates against people who might choose to keep or favour the dog du jour. So whatever media dog is featured at the moment. And I'm one of those people. So my breeder Amstaff, that's an Amstaff. They're an American Staffordshire Terrier, which is a type of pit bull. That's absolutely the case, and BSL has always done that, and indeed there's documentation that tells us about the kind of development of the Dangerous Dogs Act DDA in the UK, which was enacted in response to a child was killed by 2 Rottweilers, tragically. And before that, a child was killed by 2 dogs that were referred to as pit bull terriers that had broken through a garden fence into a neighbouring kind of garden. And the Tory minister at the time blatantly said, and this is documented, this jackass behind me, blatantly said that he couldn't go after Rottweilers because wealthy people keep Rottweilers. So that's documented political information. So the impetus for BSL in the US has always been about targeting certain communities, minority communities, and BSL in the UK was always about targeting certain communities there, and it's no different here. This legislation is directed at targeting particular people, and therefore what that does then is that means that people like me, who would be considered middle class and educated, there is surprise when I have dogs like this and work with communities who keep these dogs, and I've worked with all manner of communities involved in these dogs, and that's part of that discriminatory sort of effect. So what this means is that the language that we use to describe these dogs is geared towards discriminating against the people. And even when we look at people who are certainly appear or even go to protests and things like that, they will say things like, oh, blame the other end of the lead, or oh, there's no such thing as bad dogs, only bad owners. And all of that is completely flawed, because the people who choose to have dogs, well, first of all, it's none of your business if somebody wants to have a certain dog, but the people who choose to have dogs, and we have to believe this, the vast majority of people who choose to have dogs love their dogs and want to do the best for them, of course. And I look back on things that I did 10 years ago and be like, oh my God, what was I doing? And so there's glass houses and stone throwing and all of that. So it's incredibly important that we're being very, very careful with how we discuss these dogs, because we're discussing people as well. And this kind of, I suppose, rounds out the whole conversation, because dogs have been a part of human society for tens of thousands of years, if not longer, and an integral and central part of human evolution, and the development of communities. And that means that if we want to improve dog human safety, that this requires societal and community-based efforts rather than sensationalized, ineffective legislation, which is essentially what we have. And that's why it's never going to improve safety, because these are societal issues, and it means that societal support and community movement is required.
Really well said. And I suppose talking about the other end of the lead, in a different context, when dogs end up on a restricted breed or a banned breed list, how does that affect the lives of responsible pet owners?
Well, I guess you start to become targeted, right? And you are presumed to be irresponsible. You're presumed to not want the best for your dog. You're presumed to be presenting some sort of danger within your community. And that means that that's going to impact people at every level. So it's going to impact people's relationships with their dogs. It's going to impact people's ability to provide an appropriate standard of welfare for their dogs. It's going to impact societal relationships. It's going to impact community health. It's going to impact financial resources. And everybody in this country, and I'm sure in many other countries as well, will agree that there are huge financial pressures on people now in terms of inflated prices of everything, right? So, when we look at the relationship between dogs and people, one of the ecological relationships that we look at may even be considered a competitive relationship, as in when resources are scarce, the family dog might have to be sacrificed in terms of, competitiveness between the availability of resources to put food on the table for children. Or what we see a lot in this country particularly is in terms of people having to move to subsidized housing, where or have to move to another private house, like an apartment or a rented accommodation where dogs or other pets aren't accepted. And so those things immediately put pressure on families. And what's important to understand is that county council housing, for example, around the country, and local authorities around the country won't accept breeds that are listed on the restricted breeds list. So they're not allowed to have those dogs. Most home insurance policies in Ireland will not cover restricted breed dogs, and this may put extra pressure then on families who are already struggling to keep their family together. And this is why I feel it's particularly important to talk about the messaging we use in relation to people. So if we say things like there are only, what is the thing? There are no bad dogs, only bad owners, things like that. For somebody who does a lot of work with in behavior work with people and families and their dogs. All that does is that makes people less likely to seek help. It makes people more likely to feel targeted, and it becomes detrimental to the animal's welfare ultimately. If we only assume that every person is out to do damage to their dog and to do terrible things to their dog and to behave so-called irresponsibly, well then we're already damaging those kind of relationships that are built within society. Like, dogs have been part of the fabric of human society forever, and it's important that we consider that. And like you say, holistically, that's really what we're actually talking about here, is how can we repair and maintain those community ties, and ultimately by working through people, we improve the welfare of dogs. We can't do it without them. As often as sometimes as frustrating as that can be, because I'll often say things like, oh, the dogs are the easy part, right? And anybody who works with dogs, I think, will say that. But we can't do it without the human end. That has to be a central focus.
Definitely. And like you say, actually, one thing you mentioned was the insurance. I mean, not even just home insurance, but I've heard recently from some professionals, at least some insurers, for example, for groomers or for dog walkers, they may not be covered for restricted breeds.
They've never recovered. Some professional insurers have never covered restricted breeds. And I think what's happened is, with the recent change in legislation, people actually started to read the fine print, right? And go, oh no, this has been going on for quite a while. So that adds other pressures. And because the insurance market here in Ireland for everything, I think, is very much monopolised by a small group of underwriters, it means that a lot of businesses may be affected, and a lot of individuals may be affected, for sure.
Yeah, so it's more than just, the dog will have to wear a muzzle going out to the local cafe. It's considerably more than that. And I think people...
There are levels,
definitely. And then looking at that stigma, I suppose, that surrounds certain breeds on lists and bans, how might this affect their adoption and treatment in shelters?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've seen for a really, really long time here. And, it like we were talking earlier, like, it goes back 30 years. And it's 30 years I'm involved in this. And it's no accident that I ended up with this type of dog. I ended up with this type of dog because I am a sucker for a little bit of rebellion and a little bit of seeking that stigma in terms of fighting for something that has been... absolutely stigmatized is a good word, but discriminated against for a really, really long time. And this type of dog has always been associated with, in its history, has always been associated with kind of marginalized communities. And when Irish people moved to the US, particularly the East Coast of the US, our communities there were really responsible for the development of this type of dog, because again, these sorts of marginalized communities that were living in horrendous conditions, and under horrific societal pressure. And there is a history of that. We talk about these being fighting dogs, and for sure that's part of their legacy. Absolutely, we don't deny that at all. No dog is a benign creature, and I don't deny the history of these dogs at all. I mean, it's well documented. But these dogs have been fighting at various levels throughout history, even when they were no longer fighting, right?
As were we in America, as well known as the Fighting Irish.
Absolutely, and that's that there is this wonderful tie between not just humans in general, but Irish people and this type of dog. And there's a fantastic book by an author called Bronwen Dickey, called Pitbull something or other. I can't remember the full title. I will get it for you and you can share it with your audience. But that's a fantastic book that reflects the history of these dogs and ties in a lot with early Irish communities in New York and on the East Coast of the US. And indeed, our Irish communities in the UK have also forged the development of that dog there. I mean, they used to be called Irish Staffies. Staffies being Staffordshire, right? So it's not a very Irish thing at all. But they were referred to, they have been and continue to be referred to as Irish Staffies, and that's that intertwining of human communities and dogs is something that's been present forever. And it means that we have such a responsibility to maintain the safety and integrity of dogs in our communities. But bringing that to modern times, because of that history and because of the predominant media status about these dogs, has been that these dogs are killers, and that's what's promoted. And it's very easy to convince people of something to be fearful of. That's a really easy, and that is what the algorithms are designed to do, right? You're going to know more about that than I will. For sure, that's more your world. But I mean, it's pretty obvious when you look at what makes up your social media feeds. It's all about selling fear to us in some way. So it's very easy to establish that, and that's what's been done since the 70s in the media about dogs who look like Decker, as my dog. And it's much harder to turn around and say, well, actually, there's some nuance to this, because I would never say that these dogs are harmless or anything like that. There is nuance to this. So because of that long-standing idea, and because the association that's been made in media between dogs that look like that and so-called thuggish behaviour, we certainly are going to see the people that we might consider the wrong people, again, air quotes going mad here, the wrong people attracted to these dogs, and the right people being turned away, or avoiding wanting these dogs because of that. And that absolutely affects these dogs if they become unwanted. Ask any person involved in rescue up and down the country how difficult it is to place a dog that looks in any way bulldogish, and then we bring in further complexities to that. So we bring in extra legal implications, extra housing requirements. So for example, they can't go to county council housing. We bring in bans. We continue this relentless media circus surrounding them and their behaviour, and we, again, the messaging and the terminology we use, right? So we'll say, oh well, if you want one of these dogs from us, to adopt one of these dogs from us, you must fulfill extra special requirements or criteria that aren't necessarily required for adopting a fluffy dog or a white dog or whatever, another coloured dog. And again, these are discriminatory moves. They're not just moves discriminating against these dogs, but people who might be interested in them, and that's a big problem. That's a huge issue. That's the trend, and we've had a lot of well-intentioned moves have resulted in further damage for these dogs. So our animal welfare working group, again, kind of replicated what they've done in the UK in terms of banning the importing of cropped dogs. And any move made against cropped dogs is a move made against dogs that look like this. Yes, other breeds are cropped. Yes, Great Danes are cropped, Dobermans are cropped, for sure. But really, this move was made against discriminating against people who were associated with dogs who look like Decker. And what that's meant here is that crop dogs from local authority pounds, for example, cannot be homed directly to members of the public. They can only go to specific registered or licensed rescues. I think there's only about 10 of them in the country. So this sort of move is short-sighted, and it isn't about the welfare of the dog at all. It's a political move to be seen to be doing something, right? And this kind of discrimination against crop dogs and rescue was something that historically happened in the US, and again, coinciding with BSL and discriminatory practices in relation to that. And what they found now is that, oh no, it's really difficult to move crop dogs, surprisingly. And now there's hashtags adopt the cropped and all this sort of thing, because we have to turn this around. And I'm not an advocate for cropping. Let me just say, ear cropping, which is a surgical procedure, right? I'm not an advocate for that at all. But also at the same time, I don't want to stigmatise dogs or people who have dogs who are cropped for whatever reason that might be. They might have adopted this dog from somewhere else, and cropping is banned here. It's banned in legislation here. So let's enforce that legislation rather than targeting dogs who are languishing in local authority pounds.
I totally agree, and I suppose that leads on to my next question, really, of what alternatives to breed-specific legislation would you recommend for reducing dog-related incidents in communities?
So much stuff at societal and community level. So first of all, we have a really big statute book of animal welfare legislation in this country. So let's enforce, let's resource and enforce existing legislation, right? Let's develop breed neutral legislation that makes sure that we can facilitate improved community focused guardianship. So that means educational programs at community level subsidised. Let's make sure that dog wardens and the local authority pound system is better educated, because right now it is not. Let's make sure that rescue or voluntary organisations have the ideal funding and support structures so that they can adequately provide for and resource the work that they do. Make sure that they have access to the training and education that local authority pound system should, and make sure that those systems work together, right? Or some version of that. Make sure that we have community-led and community-focused resources for people in relation to keeping their dogs in good health. And rather than always targeting the lowest common denominator, why don't we go and look at, well, what are people doing? What do people actually need facilitating and help with? How can we enforce legislation? But most of all, I mean, we could just take very, very simply, if we look at one of the jobs that takes up the bulk of the dog warden's time, local authority dog warden's time, is license chasing. So, why can't we, instead of everything being a punitive measure, why can't we start to develop programs where we could have local authority figures in preventative positions, so that we could actually proactively prevent welfare slides? And we have legislation that supports that now. We have the Animal Health and Welfare Act, which supports preventing things getting to a cruelty stage. So let's resource that and make sure that that's something that can be put in place. Let's look at the sources. Where are these dogs coming from? Let's look at tightening up DB regulations and making sure that's enforceable, and that there's actual accountability there when it comes to anybody producing dogs. Anybody who's producing dogs and putting dogs into communities must have some sort of accountability. And again, if that includes voluntary organisations, well, then let's make sure they're resourced in order to be able to do that. Let's make sure that regular people, have access to good education about dog behaviour. So instead of making it punitive and instead of making it breed focused or sensationalised, we could actually teach them what we've talked about tonight. We could actually go and look at ways to improve people's awareness in terms of child dog safety, for example, in terms of keeping your dog safe and other people safe in public spaces, in parklands, around the streets, wherever that happens to be. So the level, we've talked about this before, but the level of knowledge about dog behaviour and dog care is woefully poor at all of the levels. And Ireland actually has quite a good track record of producing state-funded educational programmes. So you only have to think of, Irish people are actually quite good at kind of doing the community thing. Yes, there's always outliers, but humans are human. But I mean, in general, so like look at us, things like taking up the smoking ban or putting our trolleys back, right?
Yeah.
When we actually incentivize those behaviours, Irish people are quite good at going, okay, well, this is what we do, right? And we kind of get on with it. Even if we look at the early days of the pandemic, like the performance of Irish people in terms of mask wearing and social distancing and staying at home and all of those nightmare things that nobody wants reminding of. Why are we talking about this? And our government has generally produced quite good resources in relation to this. And yes, there was a campaign earlier this summer produced by the Department of Minister Humphreys, but it was all completely punitive. It was all blame based. It was if your dog bites somebody, we're coming for you. That was the educational, the responsible dog ownership educational program, which is ridiculous.
It's something I say about Ireland all the time. So as many regular listeners will know, I lived in Germany for about a decade, and I say it so often about so many things in Ireland that like you say, we all kind of want to do the right thing.
Yeah,
we all want to take part in it and have a bit of crack along the way.
Yes.
And like if you get a bit of a badge or something, you'll probably
Irish people are in.
Yeah, exactly. You'll laugh at it, but you'll take it. And I think like we look at things from a punishment perspective.
Yes.
So much more, and it's like, why? We don't respond well to it. We don't like it. We don't like being told that we've been very bold and that we need to go to penance. We like to be doing things the right way and collecting our points or our stars or whatever. So it's I think imagine a situation where if you get a puppy, you can go to free government funded classes.
Absolutely.
Where someone can sit down with you and say, watch these video clips, and these 5 behaviors together. If this is happening with your dog, it's so likely that they're about to snap. You need to go see a pain consultant, you need to go to see a vet, you need to go see a physiotherapist, you need to find your team of people to help you out here.
And that's something we talk about all the time, is that collaborating amongst allied professionals, so that essentially what we would have is every dog that comes into a family has a care team around them, built in, ready to go. So there's the vet, the RVN, there's the behaviour people, the training people, the grooming people, the pet supply people, all of the people, and those things are immediately there and available, and it's teamwork amongst those allied professions, which are all kind of overlapping and working, but very much independently, and so busy with their own things. I mean, this is nobody's fault, but absolutely having that in place. So having that support structure that exists and is available and ready for people to go, and thinking about how we supply dogs, like the actual the cultural attitude that we have to dogs. And this is behind the whole thing, is our cultural attitude to dogs. So on the one hand, dogs rescue people and they're assistance animals, and they're doing amazing things, and they're telling people that they're going to have some a seizure or whatever it is, and they're heroes, and they rescue children from burning buildings and all those sorts of things. And then the exact same media outlets will report on dogs that have bitten a person or chased a bike, and again, not downplaying the individual experiences there. So dogs are put on this pedestal that they couldn't possibly maintain, and as soon as they act like normal dogs, they have such a great height to fall. So this comes from our cultural attitude to dogs, and where that idea comes from is like, there's no bad dogs, only bad owners, is that this idea of a dog turning on their master is culturally ingrained in us as being something that is just worthy of absolute death. It's unthinkable. It's
taboo.
Right, when actually almost all of the people I work with who have been bitten, but there's been bites within the family, those people are doing absolutely the best they can, and it's an amalgamation of circumstances that lead to these sorts of things happening. And again, it's nobody's fault, it's not about blame, but it is about accountability, and it is about raising awareness. So it all comes from this idea. So that's why I'm incredibly slow to share stories about dogs love us more than they love themselves, or this dog barked and their owner got out of a burning building. The dog barked because they needed a primate with an opposable thumb to open the door. Like this sort of thing. And the thing is that dogs are the most amazing, uninhibited, wonderful creatures without ever having to do any of that stuff for us. Yeah. They are not tools to support humans. That's not what they exist here for. They exist in their own right in the most wonderful, fantastic ways. And I have to say that because I've devoted my entire life to dogs, so it would be a terrible disappointment if that wasn't the case. But, so it's this idea that they have to perform for us, that they have to do things. And even the things we say, like, humans are so gross. We say things like, oh, man's best friend. Really? What choice do they have in that? We have taken away every other option they have in the world. They are completely reliant on us, and programmed by our selective breeding to like us more than they like other dogs. They have no opportunities for reproduction or for basic biological needs without access to humans for the most part. And then we turn around and say, oh, they have to be our best friends and they can't ever bite us. It's a really raw deal for dogs. And even if we talk about like that nesting behaviour and things like that, people giggle at that. But that's as normal, natural, necessary behaviour as biting is, as barking is, as tail wagging is. And it happens under specific contexts, and it happens because it functions for dogs and it's inbuilt as part of them, like all of those other behaviours are. So we don't get to pick and choose. We don't get to decide, oh, well, we only like dogs when they're cute and fluffy and doing things for us as if they had any choice. We either want to support dogs and have them as part of our lives. And if we want to have them as part of our lives, well, then we have to make adjustments to the environment to incorporate that. That's on us. Absolutely. That's not on dogs. Dogs Absolutely. Have no say in this.
And I suppose when we're looking at policymakers, and particularly because, rounding out a conversation now on breed-specific legislation, and we've kind of debunked a hell of a lot of the reasons that it might have been put forward in the first place. what should we be focusing on? I guess it's a lot more on the education piece, on the community piece, and a lot of the positive things that we managed to touch on, right?
Yeah, for sure. And this, this is the really difficult part. So the working group that is behind this latest kind of legislative move were put together in order to expand restricted breed legislation, and there was a different plan in place based on other things that have happened, other incidents that have happened, and that's kind of been sidelined right now. So it was flawed from the very start, because the very fact that you would have to expand the restricted breeds list tells you how ineffective it is. The very fact that you have to expand breed-specific legislation to include banning tells you how ineffective BSL is. Like, this is a self kind of, burn. And that's what they were kind of doing. So we know now that this ban is happening, and it was in the eyes of the minister very early on this summer, unfortunately. So what we have to do now is we have to look up the best ways that we can to support the guardians of these dogs, so that we can keep these dogs in their homes. Because what these dogs do not need is what we've already seen, is this sort of panic of in terms of these being unwanted dogs, and now people believe that these are dogs that are going to kill people and all of these sorts of things, which isn't the case, by the way. And if you own an XL bully dog, or a dog that might be characterised as an XL bully dog under this legislation, your dog is still the same wonderful dog he was months ago. He or she is still the fantastic companion that you've always known and loved. So we want to support those guardians in keeping their dogs, and support those guardians in complying with the legislation. So the best way to do this, right? So what are the things that they can do to do that? And also, if they feel that they need support, or they have questions about their dog's behaviour, of course reach out. I am absolutely willing to help any person with an XL bully dog, or a dog that they feel might fall under that legislation, at no cost. There's absolutely no problem. Come and have a conversation, and we'll do what we have to do to keep that dog in their home, and keep people together, and help you support that dog and that person out in the world, and all of those sorts of things. So that's something. We also need to look at messaging, particularly online, and the language that we use about people who might want these dogs, or about the dogs themselves, and that's exceptionally important. If I may, myself and some colleagues have developed a kind of a stakeholder group called Dogs in Society, and we have developed some evidence-based resources in relation to BSL, which I'm happy to share. Like, this is completely voluntary, there's no cost, so we're not making any money out of this, but we would love to have input from as many people as possible. We have some legs in various different places doing some legal stuff and some community level stuff, hopefully, and that kind of thing. But certainly we would love to be able to promote this organisation and have people on board, so that we can get as much support and evidence-based care and information out to as many people as possible, and provide those supports. So I might push that a little bit.
Please, absolutely. And any of the links that you have for this, we will put them into the show notes as well, so that everyone can find them everywhere that you're listening or watching this.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. And we have we've written a fully evidence-based and referenced statement on BSL. So if anybody wants further information, and really to understand the background to what BSL is and why it's so ineffective, and what we could do as alternatives, that's all provided there as well. And again, backed by valid data too.
Absolutely. We will also link that. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing so much of your knowledge with us. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me. I love talking about dogs, so I will do it for any length of time. You have to rein me in.
Oh, amazing. No, we appreciate it so much.
Thanks a million. Thank
you very much.
Thanks so much.
And once again, a huge thank you to Anne for joining us on the podcast this week. If you'd like to find out more about what Anne gets up to and what Annie Ed provides, then you can check out the links in our show notes. You can equally find the links to Ruby Reese, or you can head on over to our website, ruby-reese.com. And please do remember, if you've enjoyed this episode, consider following us or subscribing to our channel wherever you listen to this podcast. We look forward to seeing you join us again for another episode next Tuesday. Thanks for listening in.